I suppose, comrades, everyone appreciate that since the evolution of our strategy and tactics document in Morogoro, Tanzania, in 1969, the international pillar of struggle constitutes an indelible feature in the arsenal of the African National Congress as we seek to prosecute the people's struggle. Of course, comrades, today we are equally mindful and conscious that the entirety of the liberation movement and the African people have suffered a substantive loss due to the death of the founding figure of the African liberation struggle, President Kenneth Kaunda, the first president of Zambia, who led the struggle for colonial independence from Britain in 1964. Comrade President KK opened Zambia and made it the home of the headquarters of the African National Congress for over 30 years. And through his leadership, comrades, we are reminded that Zambia became the fortress for the frontline states and the prosecution of the liberation struggle of all African countries. Comrade Kaunda was a great internationalist, and we recall on this day with fondness that he was the chairperson of the non-aligned movement NAM between 1970 and 1973. Likewise, comrades, the 1955 Bandung Conference shaped our understanding of global solidarity, opposition to colonialism, and neo-colonialism in all its forms. And therefore, it is our submission that Pan-Africanism is defined by a common experience rooted in a shared history of slavery, colonialism and apartheid, and continued racism, as well as the continued structural underdevelopment of the African continent. It is therefore our belief, comrades, that unity is pivotal to ensure economic, social, and political progress, which ultimately must have an end product, the unification of all people of African descent. It is therefore my honor, comrades, to dedicate this particular IR discussion to the memory of this great Pan-Africanist. Importantly, comrades, today's panel discussion seeks to imagine the African world within a globalized world order, which has become more volatile, is more uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And through the realization also, comrades, that we are in a steep transition from what we regard in the past as unipolarity to multipolarity. Evidently, comrades, Africa is confronted with cross-cutting issues, including global warming, terrorism, global pandemics, such as your COVID-19, and cybersecurity. Comrades, on the occasion of the 66th celebration of the Freedom Charter, which was the statement of intent that directs the freedom struggle of the people of South Africa, we are equally reminded that the Freedom Charter were quite instructive, that we should be continued to be seized as the descendants of Howard Tambo, Nelson Mandela, on a just, peace, and equitable world order. Central to our progressive international outlook, comrades, is Pan-Africanism, and today we will seek to reimagine what is the dialectical relationship between the prosperous South Africa we envisage to achieve in 2030 and this prosperity of all Africa envisaged in Agenda 2063, entitled The Africa We Want. And therefore, comrades, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the ACFTA, we regard as an important repository in our arsenal as we seek to negate from poverty and under of South Africa and the African continent. But more importantly, comrades, we envisage that the ACFTA will be able to harness the youth dividend in Africa, where unlike Japan, which is faced with an aging population, Africa has a youth dividend and a youth bulge. Our panelist today, comrades, is the ANC IR Subcommittee Chair from the side of the National Executive Committee, The second panelist will be the APRM representative, Mr. Hamote. And the final panelist, comrades, will be the IR Subcommittee Economic Diplomacy Task Team Head, Comrade Tome, who is replacing the SG of ACFTA, Comrade Mene, because of connectivity and travel constraints. Our respondents, comrades, thereafter will be the Global Dialogue Executive Director, Dr. Mtembu, which will be followed by the response from the University of Pretoria lecturer, Dr. Mbete. And our response today, comrades, will be concluded by the Congress Youth League, represented by the National Task Team member of the ANC Youth League, Comrade Good. Having said that, comrades, allow me at this moment to introduce our chief panelist, Comrade Lindy Zulu, who is the member of the NEC, having first been elected in 2007 in the National Executive Committee. She has been special advisor, comrades, to the President on international affairs. She has been the special advisor to the Minister of International Relations, and is a former head, comrades, of the Pan-African Women Organization in Angola. Apart from that responsibility, comrades, she was stationed in Zambia, she was stationed in Uganda. She's well-traveled, she's compassionate about the plight of the African people. And without any further ado, Comrade Lindiwe Zulu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Comrade Alvin, the moderator. And thank you very much to all the comrades and the public who joined here today. I wish to also thank some of the NEC members that are here. I've been informed that Comrade Zwelim Kize is here. I'm also excited that Comrade Stellanda Ben-Abrahams is also here, because we really want to focus on young people. We also think that the future is technology. Hence, we are here connected like this as we are today. I wish to thank you, all the comrades who are National Executive Committee members who are here, as well as the subcommittee members. And I do want to thank them, because without the National Executive Committee members who attend to our discussions and meetings of the IR International Relations, as well as the comrades who have actually joined us as an extra support to the NEC, who are always stepping up in terms of issues related to international relations. And I also wish to thank everyone who took their time to join here today, especially the panel members, as well as the respondents. For me, this is a very important webinar that we are doing as the International Relations Subcommittee, especially because we really have to do everything we can to prepare for policy conference, to prepare for NGC, to prepare for the conference itself in a few years to come. And therefore, COVID or no COVID, we believe that the work of international relations must always continue. We learn lessons also from the international environment and everything that is happening, and how the world is trying to deal with this drastic COVID-19. And I'm sure most of you are aware that the president will be speaking tonight. As I'm sitting here in this meeting, the NCCC is meeting in preparation for that. I also want to thank the young people who are here, because we believe that young people, we don't say to you, you are the future. We are saying you are yesterday's, you are today, and you are the future. So I'm happy that the Youth League also has joined, because it's important for them to be appreciative of the work that we continue to do in relation to international relations, as well as foreign policy. So I wish to express my gratitude to all of you who are participating in this Umrabulo webinar on international relations, where we will elaborate on a few salient aspects of our National General Council discussion document. To this end, this roundtable panel discussion will focus on the African continent free trade area and the youth dividend. We gather at a very difficult time when our life activities are largely defined by the restraints that accompany the coronavirus disease of 2019, COVID-19. And as we gather today, below 2% of African population has been vaccinated, and approximately 20 African countries are in the middle of the third wave that is fueled by the Beta variant of the virus. According to Africa's Center for Disease Control and Prevention, this third wave is remarkably higher than the peak of the second wave. As members of the global community, our communities and people, especially the poor and most vulnerable among us, are all battling the ravaging effects of this virus. Lives, livelihood, and the assumptions that underlie the structure of our societies are drastically being shifted. Consequently, and in the quest to set our local and national economies on a path of reconstruction, renewal, recovery, and sustainable growth, our governments are evoking the central tenets of people-centered governance, because in the main, it is through behavioral change and inclusive participation that Africa is going to emerge victorious against this pandemic. The ANC-led government remains steadfast in providing leadership where the challenges that are relevant to this pandemic are concerned. As we accelerate our vaccination rollout program, have continuously been improving other transversal responses. On the strength of South Africa's strides in relation to COVID-19, earlier this year, the African Union's Bureau of Assembly of Heads of State and Government announced that Comrade President Cyril Ramaphosa has been appointed as the AU champion on COVID-19. Following his appointment to this role, President Ramaphosa established the Commission on African COVID-19 Response. And it is important for us as Africans, if I may say, at this point in time, to also speak about the issues of leadership and our leaders leading in front in terms of this COVID-19 and its impact. It also about our leaders also striving to really be frank and honest on the impact of this COVID-19 on our people. Represented by Comrade Cyril Ramaphosa, South Africa's contribution and leadership in the area of COVID-19 is among countless spheres of life where the ANC continues to advance its international relations objective of building a better Africa and a better world. In assessing the international balance of forces, we note that right-wing movements in their different hues are rejecting multilateral cooperation as the abiding framework within which we should collectively govern global affairs. Vaccination nationalism is the most immediate manifestation of how these movements and their self-interested economic pursuits do not want to operate within common restraints. They wish to unilaterally impose themselves upon us all. Accompanying this rise of the right-wing movement in the acceleration of inward-looking trade and industrial development in which national self-interest, particularly the West, is sharply expressed. The strengthening and the reform of the United Nations and associated institutions are the most legitimate platforms for the reversal of these challenges should be sustained. The same is true for the reform of international financial institutions. Therefore, we call upon all progressive forces to stall these right-wing tendencies because they weaken the principle and practice of the sovereign equality of states. The commitment to strengthen the African Union and Southern African Development Community SADC as platforms for a progressive African agenda remains key on the continent. This has given rise to the reform of AU, the strengthening of the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD agency, and the launch of the African Common Free Trade, AFCFTA. These initiatives are practical examples of how, in pursuit of the African Agenda 2063, we as Africans are putting in place the trajectory upon which the Africa they want will be founded. Yet the impediments of the renaissance of Africa remain, and very little is changing in the political economy of Africa. The global tendencies that I described earlier threaten to worsen our prospects and deepen the jobless economic growth that is marked by skewed income distribution, volatile national economies, fragmented and uneven development across regions, resource dependency, political instability, and rise of multiple insecurities, for example, natural disasters, climate change, diseases, particularly COVID-19, we are facing right now. Notwithstanding, there are many opportunities for the ANC as a revolutionary movement to work together with like-minded formations across the continent and the world towards intensifying alliances for progressive, just and fair world order. This will require reassessment and strengthening of revolutionary ideological posture and consolidation of progressive alliance and solidarity at home and internationally. It also requires that we must reach out to compatible social movements and critical civil society formations. Key among today's deliberations must be deep reflection of the foremost priorities for our region and the continent as a whole. In so doing, our efforts must be steadfast towards one. Key among today's deliberations must be deepened reflection on the forefront priorities for our region and the continent as a whole. In doing so, our efforts must be steadfast towards driving the African integration, which is a long-standing objective that has its roots in the Pan-African Conference and has been notable since the immediate post-independent period. The integration objective that was specified in 1963 in the founding document of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, which marks an important milestone in the development of Africa's economic integration. The framework it provides calls for the structural transformation of African economies through development integration, as opposed to assuming the wholesale free trade integration approach. The AFCFTA becoming an instrument for building productive capacity and regional value chains throughout Africa, rebalancing current trade patterns and enhancing intra-Africa trade in higher value-added products and services. African economies using the AFCFTA as an instrument to move away from their continued over-reliance on the production and export of low-value added exports. The ANC remains a strong advocate of the African Common Free Trade Area paradigm. For this reason, here at home, we continue to mobilize and unite all South Africans around the common vision of African transformed economy in which South Africa's key priorities and interests can be realized. Our national transformation has a symbiotic relationship with the continent-wide transformation. Africa has 17% of the world's population, of which 60% is under the age of 25, represents 3% of the world's GDP, with 3% of the world's trade, and claims only 2% of the world's manufacturing output, compared with intra-Asia trade, which is 52%, North American trade, 50%, and intra-EU trade, which is 70%. Intra-Africa trade is small, covering only 16 to 18% of traded goods. Among other factors, the low levels of intra-Africa trade results from the continuity of colonialism into present Africa and the exclusion of the informal sector by the market trade research methodologies that are in use or epistemic colonialism. The ANC views its role and contribution to the AFCFTA as being to mobilize the motive forces in the operationalization of the AFCFTA, utilize the AFCFTA as one of the tools to advance the African Renaissance, ensure that the AFCFTA creates opportunities to address the youth dividend, which with Africa set to double its population by 2050, reinforce South Africa's progressive initiatives at the global level, for instance, World Trade Organization, through strengthening the AFCFTA, and drive Africa's social economic development. I would also like at this point to thank you, convener of this webinar, and say that this is the month of June. We are towards the end of the celebration of June as the month of youth. And the majority of the young people who were of the 76 who left South Africa and found platforms for struggle and fight, many of them ended up in Zambia. And I'm very thankful to you that you have raised the issue of the late Dr. Kenneth Kaunda as having been the leader and was very relentless in supporting the African National Congress. I also wish to say to the young people who are participating here today, 1976 generation delivered on its mandate. We are free today as South Africa. And your mandate, young people, is to look at the economic transformation and economic development and the radical economic transformation of our economy. And it's important for you to look at the global conditions and how they impact on us in terms of our economy. I wish to thank you very much and hand over to you, Comrade Moderator, Comrade Alvin Bortes. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, the chair of the ANC's National Executive Committee Subcommittee on IR, Comrade Lendi Zulu, Ecommissar comrades of the movement. And let me, from the onset, appreciate your quite comprehensive submission, in particular detailing issues of political economy. And an important issue, comrades, I hope that everyone would have noted, is that the South African government and the ANCF said there must be a national interest document in place. But evidently, comrades, other nations outside of Africa have actually used the national interest document to become a more emboldened feature to advance nationalism. And I think it's an important point that Comrade Zulu, you have been able to raise. The second issue, comrades, which presents a massive opportunity, but which also may constitute a substantive threat, is the fact that in Africa, what Comrade Zulu says, 60% of young people is actually under the age of 25 years, comrades. 60% of the entirety of the African population is under the age of 25. So as we engage, I think we must engage to look at the youth bulge as a youth dividend positively, but also, comrades, I think there must be a level of consciousness about the substantive challenge that it may pose. Having said that, comrades, we are going to introduce the next panelist, who is from the APRM, Mr. Peter Amuchi, who holds a advanced master's degree, comrades, on political science from the Ugandan Christian University. Mr. Amoti, comrades, also holds a qualification as a Master of Science in Development Monitoring and Evaluation. He is currently the Program Officer at the African Peer Review Mechanism with a singular mandate to ensure that the APRM built a tracking tool for the implementation and the domestication of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement amongst all the various AU member states, which has deposited the treaty. Having said that, Mr. Amoti, we have the great pleasure as the ANC to welcome you.
Thank you so much, comrade, for inviting me to this memorial webinar. And I'm so happy to be part and representing the APRM on this occasional ANC deliberation on the youth dividend. Comrades, as I've been introduced, I'm Peter Amoti Katwesige. I work with the African Peer Review Mechanism, which is a continental body for fostering governance, good governance on the African continent, but also providing an avenue for sharing best practices on the African continent. And specifically, when it comes to one of the key issues that the mechanisms focuses on is the inclusion of youth in issues of governance across the entire continent. So at the moment, the Secretariat, as has been said by the comrade moderator, the Continental Secretariat is working out modalities for domesticating or supporting the CFTA to domesticate the CFTA agreement. In this occasion speech or webinar, I've been tasked to present about how youth can tap into the labor market. I'm so happy that Comrade Lindwe has already unpacked the status of youth in Africa. And I'll go straight and also agree and say that while there is a bulge in youth population in Africa, and they have historically played a significant role in shaping the social, political, and economic policy landscape in countries, ensuring their effectiveness or effective participation in the labor market remains a matter that has been given little attention. And it's always good to note that currently in all African countries, the median age of the population is actually 20 years or less. And this implies that half or more of the population are under actually 21 years of age, both in South Africa and even other parts of the continent. So even though they present a powerful force of socio-economic transformation, the experience of African youth is one of instability and uncertainty, exacerbated by wars, displacement, economic crisis, and you can't forget to mention the traditional pandemics of HIV/AIDS, and now currently we cannot also run away from the pandemic, because at least right now it has also penetrated this youthful population. So what is the evolution of youth empowerment strategies? Comrade Lindwe has already unpacked quite a lot of strategies that have been promoted, both at the country level, the first tiers that the government of the Republic of South Africa is promoting, but also when we move away from the South African spectrum, we look at the broad Agenda 2063 of the African continent, which spells out the strategies that are being implemented at the continental level. And when you look at the publication by the of the African Union, the demographic dividend in Africa, they pull out 4 steers for enhancing or for addressing the demographic dividend in Africa. They talk about investment in health, investment in education, and under education, it's where they are really mentioning issues of science and technology. They talk about issues of economics, how to empower the youth, and also they talk about governance, especially now, this is where APRM comes in at the continental level, that how can the youth dividend be an inclusive component in enhancing governance in the African continent. So much of this has been actually rendered towards enhancing or promoting youth participation in policy process by promoting human resources, programs, institutions, and systems that provide young people with opportunities to meaningful engagement and informed socio-economic and political process. And then this one is intended to have tangible outcomes. So it means it is a mean through which youth can empower themselves to influence policies that formally entrench platforms for opportunities to tap into effective policy participation. Effective participation, it means whatever that the youth are going to say is actually going to reach the agenda. The youth can complain, but when they complain and this complaint is not picked up by the decision makers, then whatever the youth are complaining about will actually not reach the policy agenda. So that is why all these strategies that the African Union is putting forth are aimed at ensuring that indeed the youth have tangible and effective participation. So let me basically look at some of the challenges that are affecting youth participation in the labor market. Definitely, there are so many. One, we could talk about organizational challenges, as well as the more general challenges limiting young people's capacities and possibilities for participation. Funding and economic dependence, since they tend to lack direct, sustainable, and permanent income for raising capital and engage in entrepreneurial skills. Even where they attempt to set savings and investment groups, they normally lack adequate organizational skills, the planning skills, and the limited knowledge. And that is why the sustainability of all these youth programs will actually not stand to exist tomorrow because of these organizational kind of challenges. Then the other challenge could be social cultural barriers. For instance, in some rural societies which are traditionally authoritative, patriarchal, and hierarchical in values where young people cannot stand up to discuss in public meetings. Sometimes these social cultural barriers, well, the youth, maybe in South Africa, they could be having a different, you could say a different model that they can speak out. But this may not be the case in all the entire country. These social cultural barriers have a tendency of limiting the youth to openly come up to air their views in these public meetings or areas where their voice can be heard. Then another major challenge is the weak and fragmented youth business institutions and structures. Several youth businesses and organizations in Africa are institutionally still in their budding stages, since most funded by young people, many of whom lack the skills and capacity to build these strong institutions. Fellow comrades, allow me to briefly talk about what could be the way forward And much of this way forward is going to look at the policy level or at governance level, but also the change of the youth in South Africa, in the region, and then in Africa at large. So one, target the youth, create opportunities to address the barriers that we have seen. Young people face experience, so they can move easily, engage in training, employment, and entrepreneurship. Example recommendations, description, establish a revolving scholarship fund for entrepreneurial graduates. But now the question is, if this scholarship fund for entrepreneurial youth has been set aside, how many youth are willing to take in on that? I'm going to go back to this in my summary. The next, we are saying, incentivize youth to become trained in business and entrepreneurial skills, because we have seen they face these challenges, and this one affects the sustainability of their programs. Then facilitate access to youth-friendly financial services, because the youth, they don't have the security. So if a youth wants to buy a computer, because the youth is so strong in developing softwares, in developing apps, the youth wants to buy a computer or a laptop. The question is, you are telling them to bring a collateral security. This means you are actually blocking the capacity of the youth to be self-reliant. Then encourage a more enabling policy environment. The paperwork that is involved in securing a license. The question is, this is a youth, he or she wants to start a business, but then the bureaucracy in securing this license could actually limit the youth to take off. Then identify and fund entrepreneurs with high scalable projects, and so on and so forth. So what would be the perspective that we exist in? And in this perspective, as I'm concluding, I wanted to summarize the main points in the presentation. One, the youth on the African continent, we need to appreciate that you are an architect for your life. In other words, once you become a youth, then you are accountable. It is always good to read. It is always good to quote people. But even if you quote 1,000 writers, even if you discuss 1,000 football players, if you do not make a self-reflection on yourself, you may never reach there. That is why I'm saying you are the engineer of your life as a youth. And we need to appreciate this. Number two, you need to build on the power of social media. This is an era of technology, the fourth industrial revolution. But the question is, how is the African youth, how is the youth in South Africa tapping on the opportunity or the power of social media to unlock diverse opportunities? Comrade Lindwe has just talked about the CFTA. The CFTA is still a brainchild in Africa. It is still a baby. But the question is, how many youth in South Africa are actually tapping into these opportunities that the CFTA is talking about? If you can recall, the CFTA has a whole component of youth. Actually, it is, when you look at the structure of the CFTA at the country level, it is the youth and women who are actually the main beneficiaries of the CFTA. And actually, they are the people who are going to ensure that the CFTA is actually going to be rolled out. The government is only putting in place a framework, but the people who are going to ensure that the CFTA is sustained at the local level, it is the youth and the women. Now, the question is, has this social media enabled the youth to tap into these opportunities to boost on their production? Or the youth are only using social media to tweet, to WhatsApp, and then it ends there? look at social media in another angle, away from tweeting. Well, there are people who are earning from tweeting and also from Facebooking. But the question is, what if you are not in that group? How else can you use this power of the social media to boost your skills and tap into the labor market? Then I always remember this, and I normally, when I'm given an opportunity to share my personal experience, I always talk about the component of investment plan. To what extent do the youth have an investment plan? Where do you want to be in the future? And since you have limited resources as a youth in South Africa, as a youth on the continent, the question is, you can only develop as a youth if you sacrifice. Today you need an iPhone, tomorrow you need a BMW, then the next day you need a Range Rover, but you don't have these resources as a youth. So the question is, why don't you utilize the little resources that you have, save, invest, and then these investments keep growing, then at a certain point T, you can get this iPhone. Then the role of agriculture. This may sound a bit vague in the context of youth in South Africa, but the reality is, take an example of the current global pandemic. At the moment, most countries in Africa are actually imposing a total lockdown, or actually they are locking down. Most of the youth are in their homes. The question is, can you do what we call the urban agriculture? Because once the country is locked down, it means production is definitely going to be at a high level. Or even when we are locked down, the eating will not stop. So that means if a youth tries to divert into agriculture, both at a small scale and also at a large scale, then we are likely to tap into the aspirations of Agenda 2063, which talks about boosting agriculture, boosting investments. Then let's now talk about the youth who are actually in the universities. There are quite a lot of opportunities there. Research, paper writing, publications. The question is, are the youth aware of these enormous platforms, World Bank platforms, Africa Development platforms, African Union platform, even the platform of APRM? I'm sure even international relations publishers call for papers, but the question is, to what extent do the youth have access to these? And that takes us back to using social media for not only leisure, but also for viable projects. Finally, the question would be changing attitude, the attitude of the youth. We know the youth, and by the way, I'm also a youth. I'm still in the category of youth according to the African Union definition of a youth. The question is the tendency that we have to be given whatever we need, we must demand for it. That is a right. But the question is, are you changing your attitude? Are you willing to take risks? Are you willing to move from Johannesburg to Cape Town if there is a job opportunity? Are you willing to move from Midrand to Soweto? The attitude. But also, are you willing to leave this comfort home of your parents? So the attitude. Are you willing to walk? Or every time you want to go to a shopping mall, it is a must, you need to drive. So the attitude. And finally, if you are a youth who is working, no matter where you are working, the question is, I'm sure most of the youth who are logged on onto this webinar, they are actually working. But now the question is, are you result oriented? Because it is on the basis of your results that actually you will be assured of tomorrow. So always aim at achieving your targets. You set these targets, follow them, and ensure that you realize them. In other words, as a youth, as I conclude, be on top of your game in whatever that you do. Be a result-oriented person. Be someone whom the organization says, this guy, this lady is indeed a youth. I can count on them. Once I delegate them to do something, they are going to deliver it. Be accountable for your decisions. And most importantly, as a youth, you be patient. As I say, growth takes a gradual process. It requires time. During the process of growth as a youth, you meet a lot of challenges, but you can only endure these challenges if you practice patience. Then the story of a butterfly, the butterfly does not wake up one day and jump or fly. There is a process that it goes through. And if an African youth embraces that, I'm sure the enabling environment that our heads of states have put in place, and with all the key points that I've summarized my presentation with, there's a high conviction that indeed an African youth will be in position to tap into the labor market. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amoti from the APRM for that comprehensive presentation. I think you have raised some very critical questions. One of it, you have said young people need to exercise regimented discipline and engage in a process of exercising patience. I think it's going to invoke a quite significant discussion. But secondly, we do concur that the ACFTA is pulsating with the opportunity to ensure that we capitalize on the African youth dividend. And I think lastly, you have hinted that you regard 4IR as a force multiplier to ensure that we reimagine the economic landscape moving forward. Having said that, let's appreciate your contribution. Comrades, our next panelist is Comrade Tomo, who regards himself as a economic activist. He's a former advisor at the Department of Trade and Industry, and he currently serves as the IR Economic Diplomacy Task Team head. He have agreed, comrades, to generate a particular level of youthfulness and make a PowerPoint presentation. Having said that, School, over to you.
Thank you. Am I audible, comrades?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to tell the chairperson, Comrade Alvin, what I no, thanks, comrades. I'm Skumbuzo, and I'll just quickly go through the agreement and maybe what's possible for young people, but the time is not enough, and maybe cover some aspects on COVID. One of the objectives, comrades, of the OAU, an integrated market for our continent, Africa, and later this vision was codified in the Abuja Treaty, and now it has culminated to the free trade agreement, having put together ECOWAS agreements, SADC, as well as East African. Now, at the moment, our trade, like our chair has
Hello, sir, Comrade Skumbuzo. You are not audible. Hello, comrades. Can the host unmute Comrade Skumbuzo?
Comrade moderator, it seems he has lost his network and he's completely out of the webinar right now. So we'll just wait for him to return.
All right. Having said that, I think what we can do at this particular juncture, because we'll give him a right or to continue. But I thought at this particular juncture, we should go over to the session on respondents, if that is acceptable. And having said that, ladies and gentlemen, we have Dr. Mbete from the University of Pretoria, who is a lecturer in international relations and South African politics. She's an associate fellow of the Center for Governance and Innovation at the University of Pretoria. And it is at the same institution where she has received a doctorate on the subject of South Africa's foreign policy during its 2 terms, elected as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. Before she was headhunted by the University of Pretoria, she served as a researcher in the Secretariat of the National Planning Commission. Having said that, I'll give immediately over to you, Dr. Mbete, to your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Deputy Minister, and thank you so much, comrades, for inviting me to be here to speak to you on this very important topic about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and really harnessing the youth dividend. Because I won't be able to respond to all of the presentations that have been made, I do just want to raise a few provocations for us to think about as we engage on the opportunities to the youth that are presented by the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Now, the first thing that I want to raise is the necessity and the importance of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement in empowering African people and really sparking the process of development, not only for the youth, but for the continent as a whole. Africa is the continent with the least amount of intracontinental trade in the world, whereas other parts of the world, Europe, the Americas, and Asia, primarily trade with each other. In Africa, we have the least amount of trade within amongst ourselves compared with our trade with foreign partners. So to explain that more specifically, in 2019, intra-African trade only accounted for 15% of Africa's total trade in 2019. So of the total trade that took place in Africa in 2019, only 15% of that was amongst African countries themselves. For the rest, it was individual African countries trading with other countries, with Europeans primarily, but also with China and with the United States. By contrast, the majority of European trade takes place amongst Europeans themselves. And what that means is that the revenue and income that is made from trade remains within Europe and serves to develop their economies and develop their societies in order to enable them to maintain their place in the world. Now, we know that the reason why there is so little intra-African trade is because of the legacy of colonialism. African economies were not designed to serve the needs for goods and services internally, but rather were really designed for the purposes of extraction in order to take natural resources, both agricultural and mineral resources, and take them out of the continent to service the economic needs of the colonial and the imperial masters, but also, as we have seen increasingly over the past over 3 decades since the end of the Cold War, that it is also being used to service the economic needs of the rising economies of Asia, South America, and the Middle East. And so one of the very important things and one of the important opportunities that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement really represents is for Africans to trade with each other and to keep our resources, both financial and mineral and otherwise, inside the continent in order for all of us to benefit from those resources. And this is particularly important when you consider that Africa is in effect a net creditor to the world. The Honest Accounts report that was released in 2017 showed that although African countries received $161.6 billion in 2015, mainly in loans, personal remittances, and aid in the form of grants, $203 billion was taken from Africa, either directly through corporations repatriating profits and illegally moving money out of the continent, or by the costs imposed on Africa by the rest of the world through climate change. And for me, what's always very important for me when you think about that Africa in effect in 2015 lost $41.3 billion because of the inequalities in our trade relations and in relation and through illicit financial flows. I think that what this shows is that Africa, contrary to the way in which we are presented by the rest of the world, is an incredibly rich continent, not just rich in natural resources, but financially rich, and the big issue that we face is that we are not able to retain our wealth in the continent, but it is expropriated, it's taken out of the continent through a number of means. So that for me is the importance of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But the second thing is that for then that the potential of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to really be fulfilled and to serve the interests and the needs of, particularly as Comrade Minister Boitas was saying, that over 60% of the African population is younger than the age of 25. And so for us to create a future that will serve the bulk of the African population, which is made up of young people, and that will serve them not as exploited resources, whether capital resources, whether as human capital or as consumers for Asian, American, and European goods, but that'll serve them as empowered economic producers and people in control of their own destiny. What we need to do is we need to make sure that in our implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and that implementation which began in January of 2021, we need to make sure that all of the way that we are thinking of the implementation needs to be through a youth lens and needs to be particularly youth focused to make sure that the structures that are being put in place, that the policies that are being put in place, that the tariff structures and policies that are being put in place serve the needs of young people and do not continue to entrench the dominance of, quite frankly, and I'll put it in these words, old people in the African political economy. The average African is 19 years old. The average leader of Africa is over 65 years old. So Africa is a young continent with old leaders. And what we need to be very conscious of is that as we develop these new intracontinental structures, that we do not reinforce the patterns of power and influence that will retain the leadership, that will keep old people in power and in control of how this continent develops. And there are three ways in this, and I'm going to end with this, that I want to leave with you and for us to think about how do we ensure that the way in which the Continental Free Trade Agreement develops does not reinforce and entrench the dominance of old people on the young continent that is Africa. The first thing that I want to highlight is how do we harness the way in which young Africans are connecting and communicating with each other as it is, contrary to the period that Minister Zulu was referring to, where she cut her political teeth in the 1970s of the 76 generation. People of the same age in 2021 on the African continent are far more linked in real time through social media and through digital technology than young Africans have been connected at any other time in history. And yet we tend to ignore these connections as being silly things of young people, the TikTok videos and Instagram and Facebook, instead of engaging with it seriously as an important resource and a basis of connection that we could use to leverage, that we could leverage upon in order to create the kind of economic connections that will lead to development across the continent. So how do we take seriously the ways in which young people across the continent are already engaging and deal with them and work with those processes in order to create the structures that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will work through? And I think an important way of being able to take those structures seriously is by having younger people on panels such as this. I am 36 years old, so I am not a youth. I've actually not considered myself a youth since I was 30 years old, because as a person of my generation, my lived experience, my expectations of the world are completely different to somebody 10 or 15 years older than me. And the people who are 10 or 15 years younger than me, and the people who are 10 and 15 years younger than me are adults. adults. Somebody 15 years younger than me is 21 years old. At 21, I was studying, I was working, I was paying some of my own bills, and I expected to be taken seriously by the people around me. Why are we not having 21-year-olds, 25-year-olds on platforms such as these to speak about the interests of the youth? The second thing I want to raise around how we think of making of really taking advantage of the youth dividend from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is that we need our African leaders to take seriously the matter of infrastructure development on the continent. The continent's transport networks are all designed. If you were to take a photograph of the road and railway network of the continent, it's all faces outwards towards the ports, because under colonialism, all infrastructure in the continent was designed for extraction, not for intracontinental trade, and for us to be able to engage with each other within the continent. Unfortunately, in the nearly 50 years since the beginning of the decolonization of the African continent, successive leaders have maintained those patterns of infrastructure for extraction, not infrastructure for internal development and retention. And what we need is for this generation, the current generation of leaders that have had the foresight to establish the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. As a first step of implementing it, we need them to have the foresight and the commitment to really develop the infrastructure networks that we're going to require for intra-African trade to thrive in the future. And then the final thing I want to say about how we can make African Continental Free Trade Agreement really benefit the youth is that we need to have our older leaders, the current generation of leaders, have the humility to step aside and to create the space for more young people to be involved in the governance of our continent. As the first president of a liberated Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all others and all the rest shall follow." And unfortunately, for young people in Africa are still excluded structurally from engaging in the continent's politics, and we'll need to take that very seriously if we are going to see any of the benefit that we could see from intracontinental trade. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much, Dr. Mbete. You have brought a new discussion to society and hopefully to the ranks of the ANC, where you indirectly say to us that we need to bring new meaning to what the ANC should be seized about in relation to your problem statement, where you have said young people averages in Africa 19 years of age, and the leaders of societies in the African states average 65 years of age. You have also put forward a proposition that ultimately the broader political debate around what constitutes a young person in South Africa, it's paramount important, given the gradient of challenges facing a young adult age 35 and a young person age 25, substantially differ in content. And I think you have spoken about how to recalibrate the African economies by ensuring that, like what Europe are doing, to upscale inter-Africa trade from the current 15% to a more economically prosper percentage. So thank you very much for those insightful and thought-provoking submissions, Dr. Mbete. Colleagues, we are joined. I think there was just a technical connectivity issues with Comrade Skhumbuzo. So at this stage, we are giving back to him to present the ACFTA as an instrument to enhance economic diplomacy and deal actually with the issues of the youth grievance. So over to you, Comrade Skhumbuzo.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Chair. Apologies. As I was saying earlier, our trade among ourselves is 18%. What that means in theory is that 82% of all the goods that we procure, sell, export, import is done with the rest of the world. Now, if we had to boost that market and trap most of that revenue within the continent, that is what will move Africa up the chains. I think now, given that context, the agreement offers Africa the best opportunity to confront the significant trade and economic development challenges of our time. It has that potential to enable Africa to boost its intra-Africa trade, improve scale, and establish an integrated market system. It has potential to be catalyst of industrial development, placing us on a path for added products, improving Africa's competitiveness in its own markets globally. Now, the COVID-19 exposed us the risks of over-reliance on single supply chain for trade. Had projected that our economy in Sub-Sahara will shrink by 2.4 previous year and by last year, and this was true almost. Now, this analysis further stated that will cost Africa close to 37 billion, just a few short to what my fellow sister was presenting before me now was saying, and 79 billion United States dollars in output losses arising from a number of factors, namely value chain disruptions, tourism, which we now know, remittances, capital flight, direct impact on health systems, and containment measures, among others. I can just sneak in a point, a personal one here, to say, comrades, if we never had the NHI, I think we'd be worse off with this COVID. Now, Africa has a combined GDP of 2.5 trillion US dollars and a population of over 1 billion, making it a substantial market from a regional and foreign investment point of view. However, without Nigeria and Tanzania, two major economies that will have not yet ratified the agreement, it is doubtful that we will have a desired market integrating impact. Now, this is the role of our current moderator in his different cap. Now, unless active interventions are undertaken at a political level to convince these two strategically important economies to ratify, they have signed and they have not ratified. The vision of an integrated Africa remains elusive. Now, in that regard, our youth as a strata have an important task to put in place an economic development and diplomatic strategy, as South Africa's economy is quite saturated, as envisaged both in the founding principles of the OAU and the Freedom Charter that we celebrated yesterday, its 66th anniversary, especially the economic clause, the people shall share in the country's wealth, subsection that all people have equal rights to trade where they choose, to manufacture and to enter in all trades, crafts, and professions. I thank you, Comrade Chair.
Yes,
Hello.
no, thank you very much, Comrade Skumbuzo. It was a very insightful presentation, given the fact that all the major economic powers in Africa, or states with economic capacity, should be encouraged to ratify the agreement. And you have cited the challenges as it relates to Tanzania is concerned. And I think hopefully it's an issue that the audience will basically respond about. But having said that, colleagues, our next respondent is Dr. Mthembu that is the executive director at the Institute for Global Dialogue. He pursued a joint doctoral program with the Graduate School of Global Politics in Berlin, and also with the School of International Studies in China. And importantly for us, the focus of his dissertations was, amongst others, to look at the rise of emerging powers as a source of development cooperation in Africa, for which he was rewarded magna cum laude. What it means that he has a plus appreciation of the role of emerging powers as it relates to the plight of African people and the continent is concerned. So over to you, Comrade Pilani.
Thank you very much, Comrade Chair, and thank you also to the panelists. What I will try to do, given the time limitations, is just try to touch on the key areas that I've basically drawn out from the previous presentations, and just maybe raise a few new areas of emphasis. I'll try to keep my remarks between 5 to 6 minutes, but Chair, feel free to intervene if you see me dragging on. I think the main thing that I'll be focusing on is really how the Continental Free Trade Area is an opportunity to build capacity and to build greater resilience on the African continent. And that fits well with some of the thematic areas around the youth that have been elaborated in this panel. If African demographics are indeed to double by the year 2050, then we'll be over 2 billion people by 2050. What is also more interesting is that by 2100, is that the global population, as things stand, is likely to be 40% African. That's by the year 2100. Some, young people being born today will be living in that world that is 40% African. And therefore, it compels us to think of the type of Africa we want to build and whether it is actually going to be resilient, whether it will be actually creating the opportunities for young people. I think the current pandemic also exposed the weaknesses in terms of Africa's connection into the global economy, its unequal connection into the global economy. What it showed us is the importance of building resilient regional value chains within the continent that act as a complement to the existing global value chains, and therefore not being overly dependent on the existing global value chains. I think this was such an important lesson with this pandemic, in a sense that Africa found itself at the back of the line when it comes to accessing PPEs, when it comes to the production of vaccines and other medical equipment that is so important in the fight against COVID-19. But if we are to actually create the necessary value chains that are required in Africa to build greater resilience, what will happen in the next pandemic is that we will be better equipped because we will have the ability to produce the PPEs, we will have the ability to produce the vaccines and other medical equipment. I mean, with the vaccine nationalism that we've seen, is that essentially Africa has been condemned to waiting for the developed world to vaccinate their populations before the continent can actually access the necessary vaccines. And what that basically condemns the African population to do is to essentially rely on their own traditional knowledge forms in order to actually deal with this particular pandemic. So if we are to become more resilient, we have to invest in those regional value chains, because it creates jobs here on the continent. It addresses the question of beneficiation of goods, because rather than just exporting raw materials, we're actually creating value chains and plugging those value chains into the existing global value chains. So this is something that is going to be important, because in the absence of strong regional value chains, bolstered by strong intra-African trade, we have essentially been left vulnerable to external events. I think it's important to also take into account that in building trans-regional trade, it's important to look at the continental free trade area and trade per se as one aspect of a broader developmental model of regional integration. Comrade India Zulu spoke about the importance of a developmental regionalism. And this is something that South Africa has been championing for several years now, both at a conceptual level, but also in practice, to look at integration not from the traditional of a linear form of economic liberalism, but to essentially link regional integration with the broader infrastructure agenda, to link it with the broader industrial development agenda. Because it's important, yes, that we are creating a single market on the African continent, but that single market will not become effective if we do not have the necessary hard infrastructure that actually links our countries together. And therefore, we can compel, for instance, our external partners to invest in that trans-continental infrastructure that is necessary to actually link our countries together. What's also going to be important is to focus not only necessarily that hard infrastructure, but also that soft infrastructure. So, customs authorities. Will we have the necessary people who are managing our customs authorities across the continent that can actually evaluate whether the goods that are entering the African market have adhered to the necessary rules of origin that grant those goods the necessary access, and that access to the entire market on the continent, and therefore avoiding issues such as transshipment of goods. That is going to be very important. That's a softer skill amongst our customs authorities. That means sharing of information amongst the different customs authorities and ensuring that the necessary conditions are in place for Africa to benefit from the continental free trade area. Another thing that's going to be important is to ensure that within the context of that developmental regionalism, is to ensure that our small and medium and micro enterprises are the ones that are at the forefront of actually benefiting also and feeling the impact of this continental free trade area. We need to remind ourselves of the profile of the African entrepreneur and the profile of the African business person. Most of our informal traders that are crisscrossing the borders on a daily basis, most of those informal traders are women. We also have to keep in mind that most of those informal traders are actually small and medium enterprises. You know, these are not the major conglomerates that are crisscrossing our continent. And we need to find a way to ensure that the Continental Free Trade Area also speaks to their needs, also speaks to creating an opportunity for them to actually enter, if that is the desire, to enter the formal market and to upskill and to upscale their operations. In thinking about that, so making sure that young people and female traders are actually benefiting, it will also be important to take into account that whilst intra-Africa trade is indeed low when compared to other regions of the world, when we disaggregate those figures of intra-Africa trade, it's important to note that in the formal figures, we are probably under, we're not capturing the full extent of intra-Africa trade. The first point is that the comparisons with other regional blocs are often not comparing like, objects. The second is that the picture of intra-Africa trade is often distorted by large-scale commodity exports. If we remove those commodity exports, which are normally destined for the developed world, you get quite a much more complex picture that emerges of intra-Africa trade. And then lastly, because our formal data doesn't actually capture fully your informal traders, we are actually not getting the full picture. An example here is that if we look at intra-regional trade, we see that yes, Africa's is the lowest when compared to the Americas, when compared to Asia, when compared to Europe. But if we break down those regions a bit further, we would see that, for instance, in Mercosur, there's only 13% of intra-regional trade. In South Asia, there's only 7% of intra-regional trade. In Central Asia, there's only 8% of intra-regional trade. In ASEAN, it's around 22%. So the figure becomes slightly less. Also, if we factor in Africa, the fact that large economies such as South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt, because of the long-standing free trade agreements they have with the European Union, the US, and other major economies, their figures of intra-Africa trade are actually lower than many countries on the continent. So for instance, you take a country, just out of example, you take a country like Botswana, its intra-Africa trade is around 45%. South Africa's is around 19%. We're trading more with Europe, we're trading more with the US. So if we take that disaggregated view, the picture doesn't look as gloomy in terms of intra-Africa trade. And I think it's going to be important in terms of the continental free trade area also having an effect on the type of research that African scholars are doing, and ensuring that the data is up to date and is able to feed our policymakers to make empirical decisions based on what is happening on the ground, but hopefully with also more innovative methodologies. And I think if we can do all of that, we would ensure that the continental free trade area acts as a catalyst towards creating greater resilience in Africa, but also towards building those necessary regional value chains. Thank you, Comrade Chair.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Mthembu, for some of the very key and critical issues. I think one of the significant issues that you have highlighted as possibly a problem statement is what will be the relationship of this multilateral instrument amongst African states, vice versa, bilateral trade agreements entered by African states with other countries in the rest of the world. For example, part of our key economic agreement that we have is with the United States of America around AGOA. Kenya recently have also concluded a significant bilateral agreement with the United States of America, etc. And I think it's important that those are the issues, hopefully, that we need to reimagine how to move forward as it relates to both your bilateral trade agreement and how to harness this continental free trade agreement. So thank you very much for that. Comrades, our last respondent is from the African National Congress Youth League, the National Youth Trustee member, who also served as both as a leader of SASCO and SAIC in the Western Cape. But it's also important at this juncture that I think the ANC must again congratulate Comrade Khulekani Skhosana, who has been elected recently as the Vice President for Africa of the International Union of Socialist Youth. So, Comrade Goodley, I think the future seems to be in good hands. So, over to you, Umzala.
No, thanks, Comrade Boots, and greetings to everyone in the platform. As introduced, my name is Umtuwa Ngudle. I'm the member of the ANC Youth League NYTT. Thanks to the International Relations Subcommittee for inviting us as the ANC Youth League to participate in this very important discussion around Africa Continental Free Trade Area. This is very important to us as the ANC Youth League because our generational mission in the country and broadly in the continent is about economic freedom in our lifetime. So we take this debate and this particular discourse very seriously. And thanks to the presenters, Comrade Lindy Wezulu and the comrade that would have presented after her. And I think let me say, Comrade Boots, that we would love to fashion the debate about Africa Free Trade, Africa Continental Free Trade Area quite very differently. And of course, I will lean my engagements in this, my respondents in the points that would have been raised by the presenters, of course, but try to draw back, this very important discussion in the African continent and happening right at a very opportune time when we have just, had our 54 countries that are signatories to the, Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and 28 of them would have rectified. And this debate is very important because we ought to look into the international balance of forces firstly, so that we're able to fashion our debate in the Africa intra-trade and regional integration in the African continent quite very well, so that we do not discuss out of context, out of these shifting realities in the continent and global. Now I want to draw back the discussion to what is this animal? This animal that we're dealing with, what is it? Because this is very important. The international system, multilateralism in it, that this international system, this structure of global governance, talks to an interstate system. That all these sub-regional and regional agreements or areas that are being developed, in all these economic regions of the world, whether you talk our own, AF CTA and, you know, Eurozone, whether you talk the NATO and you know, and other regional blocs globally. All of these are functioning so as an expression, in fact, of nation states. They function as an expression of nation states in these, you know, interstate platforms, So the opportunity, you know, for Africans in this Africa continental free trade area, you know, I link it with, you know, the founding principles of the OAU, you know, in 1963, you know, which specifically were engaging around, you know, Pan-Africanism, you know, the need for economic integration in the African region, you know, which the colonial setup of the continent, you know, did not allow, because the colonial setup did not allow, you know, trade among neighboring countries of the continent. Actually, the point that I think was made by my colleague Mbete, that actually the economic infrastructure in the continent is such that it moves from pit to pot, you know, and from plantation to pots. You know, exporting raw materials which are not beneficiated, thereby exporting jobs into other parts of the world, you know, because there has not been a deliberate effort to build the secondary and the tertiary sector, you know, in Africa, because the mineral resources, whether agriculture or the mineral resources beneath the land, had been exported as raw as they were, as such exporting jobs to other parts of the world. And this is a very important indictment that Africa has lived with for some time. And that's why I was drawing back the discussion to this animal we're dealing with, the interstate system, because a false antinomy is fashioned by orthodox theories, you know, or dominant a narrative is being fashioned and peddled over a litany of books, you know, release of papers and so on in the academia and elsewhere. That that the macroscopic forms of power have shifted from the nation state into global markets, into transnational corporations and globalized forms of communication. And that these are the decision makers about what forms and kinds of economic relations and corporations are there within, in and in between, you know, nation states, which is not true. You know, the power lies with the nation states in those platforms, the interstate platforms. And this is an indictment to the leadership of the African continent, of these nation states, that this Africa continental free trade, for it to give any meaning into economic growth, you know, the social and economic growth of the continent, it presents a very important, a turning point, actually, you know, historically in the life of the continent. This presents a turning point. And I argue, therefore, Comrade Boots, that the South Africans' policy on international relations hinges on very important, you know, two pillars, Pan-Africanism and South-to-South relations. And the South-to-South relations is very historic to us as South Africans, because it was signed at the same time as our Freedom Charter was signed, meaning in 1955, you know, and very important to us, because if you link this 1955 Freedom Charter for us and the South-to-South relations, and later in 1963, you link the founding principles of OAU, the 1969 strategy and tactics for the ANC, you know, you would find that a very important, you know, theoretical construct is being fashioned in that particular period, you know, of the need you know, for Africa to unite. Because that need for Africa to unite was talking exactly to the economic integration, much more cooperation founded on peace, harmony, and stability in the continent. You know, these were the most important principles that we're talking to this particular aspect. And I want to take this Africa Continental Free Trade area. You know, this is a long-term plan for the continent. It's a flagship, actually, of the AU in its Vision 2063, you know, that talks to the need for this Africa Continental Free Trade area. Now it is here. It has to be rectified and so on, you know. But it lays a foundation for the establishment of continental customs union at a larger scale now, you know. And this is very important for Africa, because this is the bone of contention of how these smaller states in Africa, the 55 smaller states in the continent, you know, have been hitherto drawing revenue. Now, if you are laying a foundation for continental customs union at a larger scale, this will bring, you know, real meaning into our, you know, African continental free trade area. The second part is that there is a very important aspect, because we are here talking about, you know, Africa continental free trade area and the youth dividend. And I'm therefore representing the ANC Youth League in South Africa, engaging about this particular, a very important milestone in the continent. And I would want to fashion a discussion that says, in South Africa, we have a National Youth Development Agency, very important instrument for youth development in the country. But elsewhere in the continent, there are other development finance institutions, you know, other instruments to ensure youth participation in the mainstream economy, you know, ensure that young people are participating in the labor market, but also in the strategic acquisition of, you know, stakes in the key sectors of the economy in the continent. And our argument as the ANC Youth League is that we ought to ensure that we build economic corridors out of this Africa Continental Free Trade area. Economic corridors that cross-pollinate each other in a manner that benefits all the 55 nation states. You know, in a manner that benefits all the 55, so that it is not a zero-sum game for other countries and a zero-plus game for others, that it is a zero-plus game for all 55 countries, such that the Africa Continental Free Trade area begins to view itself, you know, as an economic regional bloc, a truly economic regional bloc, you know, that can now, after it has built capacity, technical capacity for purposes of industrialization and technical capacity for technology development or advancement. You know, a point that was raised by my colleague just now, that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed us, you know, as the continent. Our low input on manufacturing, you know, exposed us that such that PPE, a mask, you know, a mask, we had to wait for global supplies coming from other continents. You know, something that is a very serious indictment to our people. You know, it's a very serious, it means our manufacturing sector is very low, such that we cannot be able, you know, to supply amongst each other. So this is a very important, you know, turnaround policy for the continent. And we want to say, as the ANC Youth League, the continent has about 1.3 billion of its population out of 55 countries, with a GDP of 3.4, okay, combined GDP of 3.4 trillion US dollars. China, as a component of the Asian Pacific, China has 1.3 billion, population, China. It is not the whole Asian Pacific, it's just a component part, but what does China have that we don't? A combined GDP of 14.7 trillion US dollars. China, we are at what? At 3.4 trillion as the entire continent of 55 countries. This is an indictment. This is an indictment that youth-owned enterprises, youth-owned cooperatives, small and micro enterprises in the continent are really not producing, are not beneficiating the huge endowment of mineral resources that we have in agriculture and the ones that are in the beneath the land. Your uranium, your gold, your platinum, your manganese, you name them, which are in large deposits, throughout the continent, but we export them raw as they are. We are saying the youth dividend in the continent, 60% of it is below 25 years. This in real terms should be an asset to the continent. But at the current moment, because we're not in this, our continent, our nation states have not been focusing, on industrialization and the need for the intra-trade, for building this capacity, this infrastructure that really connects these African countries, the air transport, sea transport, rail transport, for the purposes of transporting both people, goods and services in the continent. We've not been focusing on that at a level wherein we build social and economic infrastructure that connects the continent in a manner that is able to make this free trade area agreement, to have a huge impact in the livelihoods of Africans at a practical level, because we would have economists saying the intra-trade has grown, from 18% to 52% because of this particular sector, that sector. But if it does not change the livelihoods of Africans, if it does not change the livelihoods of Africans in real terms at a micro and macro enterprises that are participating in manufacturing and intra-trade amongst themselves. And the point was made, I think my colleague Mbet, that in the social sector, the discussion is being fashioned every day. We are interconnected to WhatsApp, Facebook, and so on. This is an advantage that Africa never had before, of being so connected, of being so connected together. I've got friends in Congo, in Ghana, I've got friends in Nigeria. But the issue about us, I argue against the point that was made by my colleague in the peer review mechanism, talking about socio-cultural barrier. There is no socio-cultural barrier amongst Africans. The question about us is that we do not have development finance institutions that are funding youth initiatives, which are so innovative that to take over, acquisition of the stakes in the key sectors of the economy, which is the point I was making about the NYDA in South Africa, that it should be playing that role now. Now that we have an Africa continental free trade area, the NYDA should be engaging DBSA, should be engaging other African Development Bank, the BRICS Bank, for us to intrinsically and interconnectedly as African youth participate in agriculture, in agro-processing, the oceans economy, in aviation, so that we can enjoy the freedom of the African skies. Us, the Africans, by developing capacity into those particular key specific areas in engineering, and manufacturing, pharmaceutical and so on. But the point I'm making here is that this enlightenment lies in the leadership of the continent, to take a deliberate effort in ensuring that these particular initiatives get supported with funding, they get supported with skills development of young people in the continent. But we do value chain mapping in the continent. We do value chain mapping in the continent in a manner that is able to protect continental infant industry. Because if we do not protect our continental infant industry through protectionism, and I argue through protectionism, the rise of the world, the so-called trade wars between China and the USA, are just one example, that we get to be so entangled in other people's, struggles as Africans, such that we cannot protect our own infant industry through the exchange controls. I think for this Africa Continental Free Trade Area to make any sense to the innovators on the ground, the manufacturers on the ground, the farmers who are participating in the agricultural sector, for this to make any sense, the infant industry has to be protected in the continent. So the point I'm trying to say, Comrade Boots, as I make a summary about the points I wanted to make, is that we ought to look into the population dividend of youth in the continent, not more as a liability, but also as an asset now for a more skilled labor force to participate meaningfully in the building of the South African economy, Because at the moment, taking advantage of the fourth industrial revolution, for example, the Internet of Things, the connectivity of health, education, economics, governance, we ought to be able to ensure that young people participate meaningfully, not through only the labor market, Comrade Boots. And these are the key areas that we should be engaging amongst African youth, and we should be fashioning our international relations agenda at this particular moment, around, and say, this is the moment that Kwame Nkrumah talked about, that Julius Nyerere said, while other parts of the world are walking, Africa must run. This is our time to run, Comrade Boots. We must run, and we must give meaning into this Africa Continental Free Trade Area by building, blocks we become a regional block, and then we can build now, after that, Comrade Boots, another transcontinental trade, We're talking a trans-regional now trade, but we must talk about transcontinental after we've protected and built this corridor of the economic corridor in the continent deliberately.
Thank you very much, Comrade Boots. Yes, thank you very much, my chief. It is a vibrant opinion from a young person, and that's why we had to give you extended time. But I think the issues that you have raised about the Abuja Treaty, the Lagos Plan of Action, the African Common Market, the centrality of a zero-plus game that should negate a zero-sum game. I think it's a very important point that you have made. So Diabulela to the Congress Youth League. At this juncture, comrades, we from the platform will entertain a number of questions or comments. We are expecting, comrades, for everyone basically to be brief. I'm just trying to check with our back office team if they can just note the appropriate person and let them just be very succinct and short.
Comrade Alvin, I suppose you are asking for whether we have questions from Facebook and the likes.
That's right.
All right, so thank you and good afternoon, comrades. We won't read all of them, just to pick one or two comments, because we see comrades are commenting in the chat group and also on Facebook. The idea is to have this conversation continuous, comrades, beyond this platform. Just to start with the comment made by Comrade Tenju Mtinto, who says that I think let's not only generalize the youth, but ensure a gender lens that focuses on girls and young women, as patriarchal relations and cultural impacts more negatively on them. Then there are comments from Comrade Hope Papo, which also there's a comrade who names themselves tngoga@gmail.com. I'll read this, even though comrades normally insist that we want to see proper names and surnames, just to always be sure who we're dealing with. But the comrade, before the one of Comrade Hope Papo's comment, the comrade says, the idea of generation mix is always appealing to me because the youth is energetic, skilled, ideas, whilst the old have knowledge, experience, memory, reference, which can never be bought or replaced. We need both for us to prosper. The saying that the young should lead alone is subjective, short-sighted, and does not look into the distant future. Along the same theme, Comrade Hope Papo says that he's calling for leaders from older generations to step aside, not a form of ageism. I thought there should always be at least a third of older leaders to work with the younger leaders to share the rich experience which cannot be learned at any university. Should we not continue to talk about having genuine generation mix? I'll end it also with another comment from Comrade Hope related to the whole issue about the manufacturing and infrastructure. The comrade says that because genuine and beneficial intra-trade of our continent depends on increasing manufacturing and infrastructure to link our countries, the notion of opening borders before doing these important basics is wrong, misguided, and cheap populism. There is an unrealistic expectation that countries such as South Africa should open its borders and allow for a free-for-all situation when we know this is not being done by other African countries. There is protectionism on several areas on our continent, and some important treaties are not yet ratified by some countries on our continent. I'll leave it at that, Chair. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Comrade JP. Comrades, there is a few of the comments and questions. I thought that just if I dissect it, if Comrade Skumbuzo can speak about there's a assertion made, Comrade Skumbuzo, that there's a protectionist from other African economies. If you can just probably come in at this point.
Thanks, Chairperson. Thanks, Chairperson. Maybe respond to other things quickly. And that is the 54 or 55 states that we have are as a result of colonialism in Africa, not by choice. And it's something that the OAU really needs to look at, because goods don't move themselves, and people move the goods. You know, sometimes we need to be self-critical. We have taken or our decisions still stand, because the world is not a static thing. It's unscientific to think all this will still be the following day. That being said, is to say, I have of the movement of persons as well as the harmonization of standards in this agreement. If not, and what are the delays? Goods don't move themselves. it may save time, as critical thinking, Chair, dealing with economic interests here in relation to young people or the youth. Now, is to ask a tough question to say, but if you're going to have economic interests, national interests have that influence this agreement. Where is the national interest, be it as the government or the African National Congress, that will influence not only economic interests, the ones that we are dealing with. We've got our troops all over Africa, and there is no, I've not seen it. There is no national interest anywhere, or be it or at the level of cabinet that I've seen. Now we will end up, if we can have the guiding document that will influence some of these agreements, signing bilaterals with companies, and the young people that will enter into this market, that we are encouraging them to space, because these big companies already have the financial muscle to do so. Now, without an opposition, a national interest paper that will influence, safeguard, protect the core of Africa, of our companies doing business in Africa. It's going to be elusive, Chair. We'll all be doomed. So from aspect, Chair, I think as a thought-provoking aspect, I felt let me raise this issue, and hopefully the leadership that is here will look into this close and really rush into the conclusion of what influences our national interests when we, I could add, sometimes you go to a country, you land there, they tell you, hey, Transnet was here saying this thing, and then the government department was here. You don't even get a sense that there is like a South Africa Inc. and like the Chinese do when they come here. You would go to country Y and you come there, you find that a company really, it is not even close to what our overall objectives are in terms of our foreign policy. International cooperation, Comrade Chairperson. So I think, can we have that, and then and then when we engage, be it in regional, the RETs in the continent, or the other stronger rivets around the world, we really have something that guides both our national and
Yes, thank you very much, Comrade Skomboza. Comrades, I have, in fact, if Comrade Pilanim Tembu, I would want you to, at a later stage, just reflect on an important debate. Is the national interest an emboldened form of nationalism? What is the pitfalls and the perils for the South African government whilst we envisage Pan-Africanism, but at the subjective level, we'll also have to prosecute our national interest. So if you can note that particular comment, Comrade Dr. Ntembo, and respond later on. At this juncture, comrades, I have a contribution from Comrade Zweli Mkhize, the member of the NEC of the African National Congress. Over to you, Kapaza. Comrade Zweli Mkhize. All right, comrades, we'll come back to Comrade Zweli. There's a question from Comrade Tumelo Pizzo. Over to you, Comrade Pizzo. Very short, please, Chief.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity. Yes, mine is a comment. It's not a question. Well, what an interesting topic here. When it was said that there is a growing threat of right-wing extremism in the global south, and now it wants to rear its ugly head in the global south. You know, this speaks of the balances of forces that the ANC must make sure that it works with. The document of international relations speaks about the organization working together with the civil society formations. So this balance of forces, we can work together with other formations, and you know, the global governance. I think we must reform it at the top there, so that we can have a meaningful change here on the ground, and it will cascade down like that from the global governance to African governance and to our nation here. And the African continental free trade, it must be liberalized. It should not be just it being said, just it must have a meaningful impact on our lives. It must open up for new emerging suppliers, so that at least they can have participation in the economy. It must not marginalize other people there. And coming to the youth, I mean, we know that we have triple challenges here in South Africa, which is unemployment, inequality, and poverty. And the impact of COVID, it's making things worse. And I think I agree that it's time that we called for a generational mix in our positions there. And I think the young people must take full of advantage of the fourth industrial revolution. Or they must not do only social media and tweets and Facebook. They must use that platform to mobilize and use opportunities that are there for them. Thank you for your opportunity.
No, the next question will be, and comment will be assigned to Tsepo Masiani. Tsepo?
Chairperson, thank you very much. And let me take this opportunity to welcome the presentations that have been made, quite thoughtful. And I think something to take and continue to engage ourselves on. Specifically, I want to focus my input on the issues raised, governance instruments that have been introduced, or rather, founded by the African. And, Chair, indicate that it now dawned on me how wise the heads of states were in 2003 to establish organs, the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council, ECOSOC in short. That unfortunately today, Chair, as we speak, in South Africa, there's little that done in terms of ensuring that such an organ exists, but not only exists, is able to act such that it's able to rally South Africa's position of community engagement and civil society on the continent. And I'm raising this issue, Chair, because when you look at the African Continent Free Trade Agreement or area, you set of a coordination which were able to mobilize society. In South Africa, the part of ECOSOC was established, and I dare to say killed by the very government of Africa. And I say this because what involved, some of us have been involved and were outside of the cohort, and we can confirm that is that which is quite openly, it's an instance where young people avail themselves to take some of these national interests forward. It's the very government that does not create space. View of a lot of structures has been is the issue of the African peer review mechanism. I would appreciate at these instruments, particularly here in South Africa, the look with regards to the manner in which we compose but also administer these organs. I say this because I want to challenge the African National Congress to state of the African Peer Review National Council in South Africa and confirm not this is a body that exudes the epitome of leading good governance based on its formation has evolved. These are important issues for us to lead young people in a they can learn. What are the things that we need to do to take South Africa and the continent forward? Chair, I just want to raise those. There are many, of course, that have raised, but once more appreciate the time that has been given and appreciate the presenters. Thanks, Chair.
Diabolela Tsepo. The next commentary will be from Lebo Matsaba. Lebo, you can enter at this moment.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I want to thank all the presenters for the great inputs. But let me just get straight to the points, Chair. I think for me, Chair, the element maybe for me that was not touched on quite a bit was the element that is also touched on Vision 2063 of the Africa at peace with itself. And I believe for me, this becomes important because there is no level of trade, there's no level of development that could ever happen in a continent that will consistently find itself at war with itself. So I then urge, Chair, that as we continue this discussion and we continue engaging even social partners, we then go and deal with the sources of conflict, particularly those that will affect youth and women, as Mam Tenji had indicated, so that we are then able to find a continent at peace with itself, so that all of these plans that we have are then able to find fruition. But interestingly, Chair, for me, from the input of Dr. Mbete on the issues of the illicit financial flows, I think what also becomes important for me, Chair, is for us to also look at how do we strengthen our financial institutions, controls, and cooperation in the movement of capital and finances. Comrades would remember that there have been very unfortunate situations where money was found with natural resources, I think at the compound of former President of Sudan, al-Bashir. There were millions of monies that were lost during the collapse of Libya, as well as the investigations that continue to plague Isabella de Santos. Now, these are monies of the continent that have left not to other financial institutions of the continent, and I'm having this argument very balanced. But this is money of the continent that leaves the continent to better other tax havens that are not in the continent. So if we are able to strengthen that these monies do not leave the continent, and when such regimes collapse for one reason or the other that we can't get into the merits and demerits of now, that money is able to be retrieved and given back to those countries as resources that belong to those countries. So I think that's another interesting area of conversation and deep diving that we should have. On the APRM chair, I think it was former President Mbeki in one of the discussions with different African leaders who had said these institutions, being the APRM and the African Union, were put together as institutions that will allow heads of states to hold each other accountable as equals. I think he then made the example to even say to themselves, they are able to say, but leader X, this thing that you are doing of stealing money from your continent, from your country, or killing your people is wrong. So for me, Chair, in the instruments of the APRM, and I would like the representatives from the APRM just to give us a small understanding of what is it that we have learned in the areas of best practice, these being the management of elections, peaceful transfer of power, inclusion of women in political, social, and business leadership. Because I believe for me, these three areas of expertise that the APRM would have collected from their process will assist us in even anchoring our understanding of the youth dividend, because it is in those areas that the youth must inherit a prosperous continent. But finally, Chair, and if you can indulge me, I would like to declare my immediate disclaimer on the silver bullet that social media has been declared. And I would ask at this point that maybe even Combat Stella could assist, because I have a fundamental problem in that social media, particularly in the continent, and we've now seen even in Western democracies, it being weaponized. We saw it in our instance in areas of the Arab Spring, in how it was used to put together popular uprisings that had no basis or were able to exploit a particular basis. The data harvesting that has been investigated in the US to manufacture particular support. So for me, Chair, I have a fundamental disagreement with these things, and I would differ with Dr. Mbete on saying this is an area where we are able to engage young people and be able to interact with them in any meaningful way, as there's a lot that still needs to be sorted out, at least in the algorithm of this social media, for us to even begin to see it as a terrain of struggle. Thank you very much, Chair. Those would be my comments and my inputs.
So thank you very much for those strong views, Lebo, how you see differently the issues of social media and your substantive commentary on illicit financial flows amongst and between African states and between other continents. Comrades, we have Comrade Uwazi Somnya, that will be the last in terms of commentary, and then I'll just give over to the inbox for the more other substantive comments just to be read before we hand over to the subcommittee chair, Comrade Zulu, to close. So over to you, Comrade Somnya.
Thank you so much, Comrade DM. First of all, I'd like to thank the panelists and also the respondents for their contributions towards this meeting. However, I find something very problematic, and it's the problem of patronizing of young people. The patronization of young people starts off with the point of call that there needs to be, young people need to be babysat in order for them to lead governments, in order for them to take a leading role within their societies, in order for them to take a leading role even within the African Continental Trade Agreement. Young people have been able to show that they are innovative enough in order for them to facilitate processes and initiatives that go far and beyond the institutional constraints that are provided to them by the current system at hand. You saw young people mobilizing in Nigeria, utilizing social media. You saw young people mobilizing in other areas of the continent, utilizing social media and other platforms. And yet young people are the only ones who understand the future of this continent, will be able to live with the consequences that the current policy processes are undertaken. So we should allow young people space and time for them to shape their own future and generation. Our forebears themselves were young people when they took over, and now we admire them as continental and forward thinkers because they were young at the time. And now we're trying to entrap them and create these incubators that perpetually lead to them not more to no upward mobility within the continent. Now let me move on to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. There is a mass realization amongst leaders and scholars that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement itself needs a lot of financing, and it needs a lot of roads and infrastructure development in order for you to initiate people-to-people transfer, people-to-people movement and goods and services, etc., etc. On the other hand, there is also the One Belt, One Road initiative implemented by China, which also seeks to creating road networks and infrastructure within the continent, and the other initiatives that the USA is currently engaging on with its European partners. I would like to know from Dr. Mthembu concerning whether FOCAC as an institution is able to integrate the One Belt, One Road initiative in order to finance Africa's free trade agreement infrastructure needs, and secondly, the potentials of a global agreement concerning the financing and implementation of the African Free Trade Agreement, resulting in greater dividends when it comes to Africa itself, integrating not only at an infrastructure level, but also at people-to-people level. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you very much, Comrade Somnia, and thank you very much for highlighting the issues with one of the South Africa's comprehensive strategic partners, which is China. What we reimagine in terms of ACFTA, what is the dialectical relations with the One Belt, One Road initiative, and I think it's a method that we will note. Comrades, we have just been requested to allow one of the veterans of MK from the June detachment, Comrade Umrabulo Musi, to make a brief commentary before we give over to Comrade JP, just to read a special communique from one of our comrades deployed elsewhere in Africa. So over to you, Comrade Umrabulo Musi.
Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll be very brief indeed, and thanks for the opportunity. Let me upfront say that there may be a disadvantage in the short input I want to make by the fact that I joined late. I couldn't connect for some time, so I missed the input by Comrade Lindiwe Zulu and had a bit of Dr. Mbete's input. By the others, I think I have a better sense of almost all that was said. Mine was to raise 4 issues very quickly. The first one, to appreciate really this initiative against the backdrop of we're discussing matters of international relations and their impact on our national security and national interest issues. Against the backdrop of the demise of KK Kaunda, may his soul rest in peace. And I would assume, therefore, that we acknowledge the fact that it's against that backdrop that we have to discuss our relations with the people of Zambia and all others who are with us in the struggle. Having said that, there's an issue of intergenerational matters that was canvassed, but this is slanted towards more youth emphasis. I want to bring to the attention of comrades that there's generations in MK who were part of the history of defining the policy trajectory of the ANC for years. From 1961 to date, we're celebrating 60 years of MK. We have Luthuli detachments, we have 16 detachment, Malinoha detachment, name them, Moncada detachments, all with well-rounded and grounded on the firm policies of the African National Congress. And I don't think I'm seeing or feeding a conscious delivery, systematic tapping in that fountain of knowledge. And one wants to challenge ourselves to do that, because I think there's a lot that then can translate into intergenerational exchange of information to further enrich our policy approach on international relations. I want to specifically, in that context, isolate Dr. Titi Chulu, who stays in Soshanguve. He's 95 years this year. We've been working with Comrade Phoebe Potgitar and the Office of the TSG to bring attention to the fact that here is a fountain of knowledge sitting not unraveled, which can enrich a range of our interpretation of the global architecture of politics today. I want to challenge ourselves to talk to such people. I'm talking General Ngose, those who were the founders of MK, whose history just resonates with our international relations. And perhaps you may want to explore that so that we don't have a state-centric issue, which is what I was reading in the discourse. We are discussing from a state-centric perspective, not people to people, party to party perspective, which ought to be informing how then the state directs its interventions with the world. And that's an area perhaps we may have to explore. I think the issues of state-to-state relations have been well canvassed. Well, there's of course many other areas we could explore. The veracity of various interventions we had on NEPAT and then what impact did they make? Peer review, what impact did they make? We need a monitoring and evaluation tool to assess whether we're moving forward or backward. But that's another topic for another discussion. Lastly, on my side, one wants to suggest that perhaps we may want to engage the correlation between international relations and the matters of national security and national interest. In the context, for instance, Mozambique is faced with a major threat of terrorism. What direction do we give from an ANC perspective to find a lasting, for lack of a better word, regional solution? I stop there. Others I will make through perhaps the chat group. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much to the veteran of MK for those important issues that I think our back office from HQ have noted it. And I think it's some of those issues that we'll continue to take forward. I'm giving over quickly, Comrade JP, to yourself. And then immediately after Comrade JP, we have the chairperson of the IR subcommittee, Comrade Zulu, which will make a closing remark, comrades, encapsulating some of the issues that continues to be raised. Over to you, Comrade JP. All right, comrades. I think if we don't have Comrade JP present, I think at this particular juncture, we are going to hand over to our chairperson, a commissar, to actually give the closing remarks, comrades, on behalf of the leadership of the National Executive Committee. Over to you, Commissar Zulu.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think let me first and foremost thank all the comrades who have been on the platform. I'm aware of the fact that there are comrades who represent IR at provincial level. The provincial representative, Comrade Pismabe, actually did send a message to say most of them are here. I also wish to thank all the panel members who contributed, the panelists who contributed, and you, Chairperson, for steering the ship. I wish to thank you. I also wish to acknowledge the comrades from the island who joined the meeting, and I know that comrades abroad have really been communicating with us and asking that we make sure we include them in some of our meetings as far as we possibly can. I also wish to thank the comrade ambassadors who are here. I know Comrade Utinzo is here and properly reminded us about the issue of women and the role of women and the challenges that face women when we talk about issues of the economic continent and growth and development. I also wish to thank Comrade Grace Mason, among the former chairpersons, also Comrade Mavivi Meagamanzini. I know also that she is here. I do want comrades to say that this is the new way we are going to be doing things, and therefore we have to connect as much as we possibly can. Actually, this is a much more improved way of communicating, because before people used to have to travel in order for us to have the seminars, the workshops, and now we can connect not only through a webinar, but we can also connect through Zoom and just using all the available technology. I also think we should thank some of the NEC members who were able to join, Comrade Zweli, Comrade Stelanda, and I know that we also are having other meetings on the side with regard to the challenges we're facing of COVID-19. Even now, I have to finish up quickly here and then join the special cabinet that's going to be taking place just in a few minutes now. I also would like to say the reason why we chose particularly to focus on young people, it was not only just because of the month of June and June 16. It is also because we believe that the importance of young people in contributing towards the drafting or the debate around issues of foreign policy and international relations. Young people do not have to wait for special meetings. They need to be part and parcel of these kind of meetings. And it's also a request to the Youth League that for a very long time in our international relations subcommittee, we don't have a representative who is consistent, who comes to the meeting. So it's a plea from you that you must make sure that you send people. The same applies to the Women's League. We need representation at all times, because this subcommittee is quite vibrant. And there's a lot of discussion that goes on beyond our preparation for conferences or preparation for the NGC. We just normally have activities that are ongoing, but we also have discussions. We have special working groups that comrades can belong to outside of this meeting. Those who want to fit into any of the working groups, Comrade Tulani, Comrade Ndumi, and the people at Lutuli House must be able to communicate so that comrades can belong to these subcommittees. But coming back to the topic itself, I think that we have been enriched quite a lot about where we need to focus on. The issues of infrastructure development, the issues of financing and funding, the issues of economic value chains, the issues of production and beneficiation. All these issues, if I may say, has been issues that if you go to the conference resolutions of the ANC, we've been very good at taking those decisions and taking very good decisions, including the issue of the national interest. Maybe it might be a good idea to indicate to this meeting that finally that document that has been meandering all these years has finally been finalized. And in one of the meetings, Comrade Naledi and Comrade Botes and whoever else they deem necessary will probably come and make a presentation to the subcommittee of the ANC so that the document can ultimately be out there for people to relate to in as far as the national interests are concerned. And also, I think here we're talking about regional integration, continental integration, peace, security, and stability as part of the issues that we must make sure we carry out and create the conducive environment for our people, especially for the young people. For me, when all is said and done, we're not here for ourselves. We're here because we need to find ways and means of creating a conducive environment for our people, South Africans, the region, and the continent overall. And therefore, in order for us to be able to create that conducive environment, it means we must really be the leaders that people expect us to be. And the young people also must see themselves within the leadership, which therefore means the youth themselves must also strengthen their own leadership so that they can be able to push at all the necessary platforms, whether it's at the AU, whether it's in the Pan-African Parliament, or whether it's at regional parliaments, or whatever the case might be. I think it's been very clear, the message that's being sent here, that we all can work together, including the fact that those that have been around from the June 76 generation, even before the June 76, they are a resource that young people can always return to. And young people also are a resource, because when we say we are a resource because we've got the experience, doesn't mean that we are excluding the fact that young people themselves are experiencing a lot that they want to contribute towards. So with those words, I wish to thank everybody for the time that you've taken to be here. And I'm hoping that IR will continue to arrange for such meetings, not because we are pushed by the fact that we are going into a conference, but generally it must be something that we do as often as we possibly can. You see what COVID-19 has now done in exposing us in particular towards the issues of manufacturing and the export that we have, including the simple things like masks, we should have been far with right now. And in fact, the procurement of all these things, in my view, from a small business development point of view, one of the things that we've been trying to do as government is to encourage government to procure from your small and medium enterprises. In the beginning, there was a big excitement about the mask, where you use the fabric and you do it nicely. And there was a lot of buying at that point from your small and medium enterprises as well as cooperatives. But that has died down. These masks that are there are the ones that are now replacing. And again, in the value chain of manufacturing, we are disappointing ourselves. And this is the platform where I think we need to keep on talking about. We've got ambassadors who are out in other countries who can be able to share with us their own local experience of how these countries are producing and consuming the products themselves, instead of waiting for export coming from other countries. With those words, I wish to thank you all, comrades, and have a very good afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the Sunday that's left. We're still going out to slug it out to see what we need to do with regards to the COVID-19 figures that are rising and the decisions that need to be made by government. Thank you very much, comrades. Keep your distance, wear your mask, and sanitize and wash your hands. Thank you.
Diabona Slalo, Comrade Zulu. Comrades, we conclude with the following quote, comrades, by Mao Zedong, who said, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend," quote unquote. Thank you very much, comrades. We will provide presentations to comrades that have sent the email addresses, and the political education unit will ensure we encapsulate some of the substantive remarks, comrades, and comments that we have received. Having said that, we are adjourning this particular panel, and we are appreciated for your captivity. Thank you very much, comrades.
Amandla.
Away too.